working with the Wall Street Journal to develop their mobile website for about the last 18 months or so, and it's difficult to develop for mobile. Can I get a show of hands of people in here who have developed for mobile devices? Okay. And raise your hands if you were satisfied with how that experience went. All right. One guy. Cool. Mobile development is still in its infancy and still requires a pretty solid understanding of this new philosophy that underlies what these devices do. Virtually all of us are coming at mobile development from a desktop background, and we try to approach mobile sites the same way that we approach desktop sites, and it's not going to work. So everybody knows what this thing is, I hope. It's the Meta Viewport tag, and you can't have a mobile optimized site without it. And this is what any tutorial that you look up in Google is going to tell you to put. They don't really tell you exactly what it's doing or why you need it. They just tell you that you need it. And it's a little more complicated than that, because this thing is powerful, but it can also configure your sites in weird ways, and it has so many exceptions that you will have to wrestle with before it is able to do its job. So before we can talk about width equals device width, we have to talk about what width means in a mobile context. When we started out on the desktop, we knew in the early days of desktop development that we didn't know exactly what screen resolution we were going to be dealing with on the user's machine. We didn't know how wide the browser was going to be on that computer. But the one thing we could trust, at the very least, was that a pixel on their screen was the same thing as a pixel in their browser, which was the same thing as a pixel in your 72 dpi PSD, which is the same thing as one CSS pixel, which is great. And then this came along, and you had Retina Displays, and you had pinch to zoom, and that all went out the window. And to make things worse, you can't really get back to what we had, the simplicity of one pixel equals one pixel. Instead, you have to free yourself from the concept of what a pixel even means. The viewport is a new concept. Desktop browsers don't really have a viewport unless you consider the browser window itself to be a viewport, but I'm going to argue that, especially in the mobile context, they're really not the same thing. It's best to think of the viewport as a hole that you are viewing your real website through, and that hole is stretchable, or maybe you can think of the hole as getting closer or farther away from the site. But the viewport, despite what the user may think, because the user sees the viewport and thinks of it as the browser window, but the viewport is not the browser window. It's a hole that you're looking at the browser window through. And that means that when you make the viewport smaller or bigger, it's not the same thing as making your browser window smaller or bigger, because on a fluid layout, when you make the browser bigger or smaller, the site moves up and down with it. But when you zoom in and out of your viewport, that doesn't happen. So Apple introduced Retina Displays with the iPhone 4, and they said, look, obviously we don't want all of the mobile optimized sites that have already been built to be 1/4 of the size on this new phone that we've built. So for the sake of this phone, 4 of the pixels on the screen of this phone constitute one virtual pixel, or CSS pixel if you like. But then the ability to zoom the viewport beyond that means that even that virtual pixel is a fairly imprecise unit of measurement. So these are things that are not going to help you if you're developing a mobile site. You can no longer count on these things being the same. How many pixels wide your site is? What about the screen? What about your style sheet? They could all be different. The site could display properly. They could all be the same, and the site could display wrong. And there's a bunch of exceptions. So there's an invisible browser on the other side of that hole. It has no Chrome, but it's there. As you know, with any regular browser, desktop browser, when you squeeze the browser all the way down, two things will happen. One, if it's a really liquid layout, it will actually reflow all the way down as tight as you squeeze it. But more likely, that website has a hard-coded width set on it, in which case squeezing the browser window down is not going to do anything but pop up a scroll bar at the bottom. Or the layout could be a fairly liquid layout, but there could be a picture or some element in there that's fairly big, and sooner or later, that is going to be the smallest that that website is going to go. So if you want your websites to go all the way down to 320 pixels, you're going to have to make sure that there are no hard-coded widths on your site and that there are no elements in there that, at least in a mobile context, are larger than the invisible browser behind the hole that you're trying to squeeze things down. That's what the width part does. It's talking about not the width of the viewport, which is just a piece of glass, but the width of the invisible browser behind the viewport. But what is device width? Device width is easy to understand with an iPhone because Apple is saying, yeah, so forget how many pixels there really are. There are 320 pixels as far as you're concerned, you, the CSS developer. So the device width is 360. Except that different mobile devices will specify a different number for how wide their device is. That number bears no resemblance to how many pixels wide the screen is. It could be 1 to 1. It could be 1.5 to 1, 1.666 repeating to 1, 2, 3, could be anything. And that number, device width, it's not listed anywhere. You'll have to query it somehow with JavaScript or something, or just read up on the specs, I guess, although they almost never list the device width on the box. And also, when you turn your phone sideways, the device width could change, or it could stay the same, depending on what OS you're running. So what are we going to do with this proliferation of device widths? Because our mobile site depends on telling our viewport to be the same width as the device width, or rather the invisible browser behind the viewport to be the width of your device. You might have a 320 pixel wide visual design that looks like this, and you might be able to get it to look like this on a phone, and you might think, oh, I'm 80% done, because it looks like this on a phone. Are your designers okay with how it's going to look on an Android device that has a device width of 360? The banner ad is no longer flush to the sides, and the buttons on either side of the logo are starting to spread out, and the even margins around the image are starting to get uneven. And then you go up to a Galaxy Note, and it gets worse, which again, your designers may be able to live with this. You may show this to them, and they're like, that's fine. Are your designers fine with this when the device width goes to 640? The designers at the company that I work for are not okay with this. More to the point, even if the designers at your company are, they can live with this, you're still going to get passive-aggressive emails from your advertisers saying, hey, just check this out on the iPhone, the ads look great, but on the Android, there's some weird padding around the sides of the ads, so if you can just fix that, that'd be cool. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yeah, no problem. I'm just going to throw some media queries on there, and I'll scale things up, and I'll flesh things out, and it's all going to be fine. Really, are you really going to add another media query every time another Android comes out with another screen size? Because I can guarantee you 3 more Android devices were announced while I was giving this talk, I'm sure. This is not a scalable solution. You can't just have a media query that just gets longer and longer as your site gets older. Or I guess maybe you'll get to edit some of the ones off the top as those devices have browser shares that drop low enough that you don't have to support them anymore. There is another way. The Wall Street Journal site that I built for mobile doesn't use any media queries, and it doesn't use any Android style sheets. It's one site that displays exactly the same on all browsers. But to achieve that, you have to understand how these different browsers think. Because each of them has quirks, each of them has things that really don't work, and yet they're broken in really different ways that reflect the mentality behind the OS and the browser that they ship with. So everybody remembers this guy. Apple tends to have an approach when it comes to building things, which is find the best possible solution, polish it as much as you can, release it, and then try to prevent anyone from using any other way of doing it. That seems to have worked out pretty well for them so far. But what's best for Apple's users might not be best for the developers. When I rotate my web browser sideways on a phone, the browser scales up the site, even though I didn't really ask it to do that. And there's no checkbox that makes it stop doing that. But Apple's helping you. Some of you may know this guy. Doug Bowman was a Google designer who quit in 2009, kind of publicly. And he ran afoul of Google's engineering-driven mindset and an approach that I guess you could summarize as put it out first and we'll update it in GitHub later. We'll tinker with it as we go. It's very markedly different from Apple's approach. What you have to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting these two different browsers, and I understand there are other mobile browsers out there, but this is a 25-minute talk. So, Mobile Safari's original goal when it was introduced was to make desktop sites navigable on a tiny viewport. It wasn't to make mobile optimized sites easy to use or easy to build for that matter. So you will be working against this bias when you try to build a mobile site because a lot of the things that the browser is doing are geared towards desktop sites. Android, on the other hand, was released after the iPhone had already achieved like a 95% market share when it was the only game in town. And so their goal was to rapidly make up for lost time. And a lot of their original quirks and presets and default behaviors were based on essentially trying to masquerade as an iPhone, for lack of a better word. I don't know how many of you have dealt with trying to make sites work on an Android Gingerbread device. That's 2.3.x. That device is, I guess you could say, intentionally, if not maliciously broken. The user agent does not contain the words Android or Google, making it almost impossible to detect. The screen resolution, when queried, will lie and say that it's 320, unless you refresh the page and then it'll be correct. I can only assume that in their zeal to catch up to Apple, that Google kind of played hard and fast with the specs and said, it's okay because we'll update it later and it'll be fine. And Android 4.1 is pretty good, but they started from a really bad place and some of that cruft is still in the browser now. I don't want to make it sound like this is just a big Android bitch fest, but that is going to be mostly the rest of my talk. So of this fully fleshed out meta viewport tag, you've got your width equals device width, you've got an initial scale value. I'm sure most of you guys have played with initial scale equals 0 because that's what everyone tells you to use. Minimum scale, maximum scale, user scalable. Which of these will Android devices consistently conform to? Not one of them. Every single one of these can be ignored under certain circumstances, depending on what Android feels it wants to do. Width equals device width is good if your site is wider than the device width, but it'll ignore it if it's less than the device width. So it's like, okay, half the time. You can set user scalable to no, but if you then set a scale on the site, it says, oh, I guess user scaling is on, because you just changed the scale. And you're like, no, user scaling is off. Developer scaling should be on, but no. It's getting better, but it's still very frustrating to work with. And as you guys know, Android's installed user base upgrades very slowly, usually in 2-year cycles. So even though 4.1 is out now, I don't know how many years it's going to be before all of the people with Gingerbread devices get rid of their phones and upgrade to the next one. On the other hand, it's probably okay if you check your browser stats, you'll probably find that no one is hitting your site using a Gingerbread Android browser, probably because they can't get to your site. Hold it. What about the Target Density DPI? If you've ever developed for mobile, you've run up against this one. Everyone says that just like width equals device width, you should set it to device DPI and all your problems will go away. Your problems will not go away. For one thing, that is a deprecated attribute. It was removed from Webkit by Apple last year, and I can only assume that future versions of Android will also drop support for it, I guess. Right now, it is the only attribute that works reliably to style your site. All of the rest of them are basically just for iOS. This is the only one that counts on Android. I can't explain why that is, but thank me later. Don't set it to device DPI. I don't know why. Set it to 160. I can't tell you why to set it to 160. But if your site is 320 pixels wide, and you tell your Android to have Target Density DPI 160, it will render a 320 pixel site at the full width of the screen on just about any device DPI device that you're working with. 400, 360, 320, 160 should work like 80–90% of the time. The rest of the time on the Wall Street Journal, we detect those devices that are edge cases, and we give them 140, which is apparently the other number that works for them. I don't know why this is. So this is a really good starting point for your mobile site. All of these other ones are for Apple. The maximum and minimum scale set to 1 will disable the zooming. That's a nice thing that Apple did for us developers. Prior to iOS 5, you couldn't disable the zooming no matter what you did. Technically, that zooming is provided by the operating system, not the browser, I would argue. But it was nice of them to say, OK, if we see that in your meta tag, we'll go ahead and not zoom for you. So that half of the meta tag makes your phone behave more like an Android device, which does not auto-zoom when switching orientations. And then the Target Density DPI makes the site fit properly on a wide variety of Android screens. There are some problems that remain, problems that are not solved by that meta tag. We're still in the really early stages of mobile web support, and there are things that you're going to have to deal with. I've got a list of some of my favorites here. I can't even tell you a reliable way to deal with them. Some of them are really, really pernicious, and I've got a couple extra minutes. I'm going to walk you through what you're going to be up against if you choose to dive into the world of mobile development. WebKit overflowing scrolling touch. You guys may be familiar with that property. That's what allows a div on the page to scroll independently of the rest of the page. People use it for nav bars. They use it for slideshows. They use it for all kinds of things. It works pretty well in iOS 5 and above and Android 4 and above, except if there's an iframe anywhere on the page, and this is a WebKit bug. It affects all of the WebKit browsers, and if there's an iframe anywhere, not in the scrollable div, anywhere on the page will freeze and stop being interactive, and people will get mad at you. Fixing it is really, really difficult. For the Wall Street Journal, we have a lot of iframed ads in our content, but we use overflow scrolling touch on our Facebook-style nav bar. I'm using my phone itself for the presentation, so I'll pull out this Galaxy S4. Here is the same site, full width, ads going all the way to the side. There's our, oops, come on, there we go. So there's our scrollable div, and you'll notice that the iframes momentarily disappeared when I opened it up, and now they're back again. In order to make that scrollable area work, I have to detach all iframes from the DOM, save where they are, apply the style to the div only then, because if the style coexists at any moment with an iframe anywhere on your page, the page will die. But if you don't apply the style and you wait until the user throws the event, then you quickly detach all the iframes, apply the style, open the drawer, now it's scrollable. And then when you close the drawer, you detach the style, reinstate all the iframes, and you don't get angry calls from your advertisers asking why their ads are gone. WebKit transform scale applied to an iframe will blow it up. It'll scale to some crazy amount. That's a known bug in WebKit, affects all the mobile browsers that use WebKit. And I don't have a solution for that other than just don't try to scale an iframe. It's not going to work. Android will trigger landscape orientation media queries when the keyboard opens because Android is a dick. The reason it does this is because technically, when your keyboard opens, the remaining available viewport is slightly wider than it is tall. So Android goes, well, now we must be in landscape mode. And come on. You know that's not what the user wants, and you know that's not what the developer wants, and it may be technically true, but it's really pedantic. I consider it a bug. And yeah, all of this stuff we've been seeing with 3D transforms and all the crazy stacking and overlays and z-indexing. Problem on Android that is tough to work around, but when you have flipped cards and overlaid sliding drawers and cubes and things, if there's a anchor tag anywhere in the stack of divs behind where your finger is tapping, it'll go ahead and click on that anchor tag for you. The only solution I can offer is to set those to display none when they're not visible, because you shouldn't be able to tap on them, right? The event should propagate only to the elements that you're directly interacting with, but they're tappable. So these are things that I don't have easy solutions for. Be aware of them before you go, because I spent a lot of time on Stack Overflow finding this stuff out, and I can at least save you guys a bit of heartache. So I'm going to go straight to questions, and I thank you for your time. OK, so the question was, are some of these bugs fixed in Chrome for Android, as opposed to the stock browser, which I guess was just called browser in Android? And the short answer is yes, some of them. Google is always going to preferentially treat their Chrome browser over the kind of phone vendor supported browser. So I can't tell you which of these are fixed in which versions of Chrome for Android, but Chrome for Android will always have the latest WebKit available for that OS, and it'll always perform a little bit better because Google is biased towards it, and it always gives it the latest and greatest. So yes, but probably some of those bugs are still there. I've seen lots of angry threads on Stack Overflow and other sites about development where people are complaining that Google seems to, remember that they give Android away for free, they seem to not terribly prioritize bugs, even known bugs. I've seen them stay unfixed for more than a year, more than 2 years in some cases. Serious bugs that hamper your ability to use the site. But I think there's reason to be optimistic if Google just decides to throw away the browser and just standardize all forthcoming Android OSs around their new WebKit Chrome, which again, they're trying to make their WebKit even more modern than Apple's. So that's probably only going to be good for Android users. So I'm going to say a tentative yes to it's a little bit more advanced. So the question is, did we develop a separate tablet version, and are we handling it different than mobile? The answer is we don't yet have a separate tablet version, but we will when we expand this one mobile site into a fully responsive site. We are essentially not building a mobile-first platform because, of course, there is a WSJ.com website right now, but the mobile site will essentially be expanded until it contains everything on the desktop site, and then the desktop site will become the responsive mobile site. I mean, we'll stop calling it the mobile site at that point. Our browser stats have shown that a lot of iPad users are perfectly happy to just use the desktop site on iPads. They don't feel encumbered by the somewhat smaller screen size. They seem okay with it. So we haven't gotten a lot of complaints by letting iPad or other tablet users use the desktop site. People seem comfortable with it. But we are eventually going to just responsive our way up where no matter what your width is, you'll get a user experience that is customized to that particular width. So it's coming. So the question is, how do you work with designers? Because they too need to be educated on all of the constraints and new concepts that are associated with mobile development, and how do you get them the information that they need, how do you get the information that you need from them. So I can only speak from my own experience, but at the Wall Street Journal, our visual designers are essentially designing a 320 pixel wide website, but their PSDs are 640 pixels wide because of Retina displays. And so they are developing, I guess what you could say, 144 DPI, 320 pixel wide, except it's not really pixels anymore, comps. That's what they're developing. They're developing 640 pixel wide sites. Androids now have a few devices like the one I just showed you that has a stated device DPI of 3, pixel ratio of 3, not 2. But I think we're approaching something below the limits of human perception when you go over 2. So I find that 2x size images are sufficient to always look crisp, and just about any other Android device, usually the ones with a device width of 360, they are usually working with a 1.5 pixel ratio. So you are serving slightly higher res images than some of the Androids can use, or for that matter, an iPhone 3GS can use. But what people have found is that you can compress the hell out of Retina-sized images because the JPEG compression artifacts will also fall below the threshold of human perception. So you don't have to bloat up your images quite as big as you think you do. You can compress them much more heavily, and when shrunk down using CSS scaling, they will still look pretty sharp and not JPEG-y at all. But in terms of what the designers need to know, I don't think it's possible for them to design like this wide range of designs, especially, at least the argument that I'm making is, don't accept the stated width of 360 or 400. Just force everybody to use the same 320 pixel site, which means everything is based on the same 640 pixel wide PSD. Everybody in the design department knows all graphics have to be 2x, and the fonts have to be set to double the size that they think of them. But again, if you set your PSD to 144 DPI, you can still use the same font point size that you would normally use, and yet when you flatten out the image, it'll look exactly right. So I hope that answers your question. Do I have any more questions? No? Oh, what? There's one.
Just one Android device announced in the past hour. So.
Excellent. Is it called the HTC J27X2?
It's actually just a spin. It's the white Nexus 4.
The white Nexus 4.
Alternative existing.
Got it. Well, the
density is different because it's white.
I think that happened at least once, didn't it? That the white one had a slightly different. No, it can happen. For any Adobe people here, thanks for Content Aware Phil. Really makes making these graphics a lot easier. Thank you for your time.